The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, starting 9th chapter, verse 28. Listen now for what the Spirit is saying to the church. About 8 days after these sayings of Jesus' preaching on the plain, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw Jesus' glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what really to say. While Peter was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they all kept silent. And in those days, no one, any of the things that they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met them. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only son." And then suddenly a spirit seized him, and all at once he shrieked in convulsions, and he was foaming at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I beg your disciples to cast this demon out, but they could not. Jesus answered, You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here. And while he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. I have to remember to bring my reading glasses with me more often. I'm in denial. I'm great denial. I'm being transformed before you. The text today is a very interesting text. It is the tradition that right the Sunday before we go into Lent, the season of Lent, that it is Transfiguration Sunday. And we read this part of the Gospel from Matthew and this year from Luke. And it is about that moment where the disciples who have been with Jesus and they've been listening to him, and they already see that he's a great teacher. They know that there's something special about him. They know that he's doing great things. He's doing miracles. They know that he is of God. But every once in a while, Jesus needs to get away. And recuperate and to pray. And so this Sunday, we hear of this instance where Jesus, who has been in the Gospel of Luke, has been on the plain with the people, as we've been talking about the last couple of Sundays. Jesus has been teaching the people about God being with them and where they're at, and amongst their pain and their grief and their struggles. And to see each and every one of us, we are all in the same boat together with God. That God is with us, and that no one is above another, that we are here together as a community. That's the kind of the gospel of the Sermon on the Plains. And then, all of a sudden, Jesus and these 3 disciples, these Peter, James, and John, who end up eventually becoming great apostles and establishing great churches within the Middle East, they go up with Jesus onto this mountain. They're ascending up a mountain. They're ascending up towards a place of prayer, to be closer to God, to be in a place of peace. And while they're up there, this amazing thing happens, according to Luke. The veil is removed for an instant. And Peter, James, and John see Jesus for who he is. He is in this other form. He's unreal. He's not human in a sense, but that he is. They know him, but they don't know him. He is different. He is other. They see him in his glory of heaven because he is also standing there with these two great prophets of old. Moses, who was the savior of the people that brought the people out of Egypt and brought the law and helped create this nation of Israel, the culture of Judaism. Moses was there. And then you have Elijah who came and helped the people see that God was still with them. Elijah, who did great miracles, just as Jesus has been doing. Elijah, who, instead of dying, a great chariot of fire comes down out of the heavens, swoops down and picks him up and takes him up into heaven. Ascension of Elijah. So, Peter, James, and John are standing there, and somehow they know, just as they know that this transfiguration, this transformation of Jesus is still Jesus, they know that these two others are these great patriarchs of the faith, Moses and Elijah, and they're talking with Jesus. Imagine yourself on that mountaintop with them, with Peter, James, and John. And you thought you knew who Jesus was. And then all of a sudden, this miraculous, weird thing that only happens in comic books. For us, in our time right now, for us, when was the last time you saw somebody transfigure in front of your eyes? Just wait for my second act. It doesn't happen that much. And so when it does, imagine your heart is racing and your mind is just whirling around and you can't make sense of anything. You can't even talk. And that was where Peter was. Peter didn't know how to respond to this awe-inspiring, this moment of God truly breaking in right before their eyes. And so what does Peter do? Peter says, this is such a great thing. I think we should stay here. We will stay up on the mountaintop. We will create little houses for Elijah and Moses and for you, Jesus. We'll be up here. We'll be worshiping you all. This is now a holy area. But that's not what God had in mind. That's not what God was doing. That's not the purpose of that revelation to James and John and Peter, the unveiling of Jesus. Just as Moses, when he came out from the presence of God, was all white and transformed and transfigured, it scared the people. He had to put a veil in front of his face. Well, this was kind of the opposite. Just those three guys up there on the mountain with Jesus got to see a glimpse of the divine. Now, the secret within this part of the transfiguration, the part that is hidden within the Greek text, is that part where those three guys, Peter, James, and John, are talking with Elijah and Moses, and they're talking about Jesus' departure that was to happen in Jerusalem. Now, when we talk about that, what do we immediately jump to in the story? The crucifixion, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and eventually the ascension. But that particular word that gets translated in English as departure, in Greek, it actually means exodus. Jesus was talking with Elijah and Moses about the exodus that was supposed to begin in Jerusalem. The exodus. When's the other time that we hear about the exodus of a people or an exodus?
Egypt.
The Israelites. There's a whole book called the Exodus. One of the first 5 books. They're talking to Jesus about the Exodus, about people being freed and liberated. About Jesus leading the people into freedom. No longer held as captives and slaves, but being the free children of God. Being the people that God has dreamt of. And all this is going to happen through Jesus. The liberation, the Exodus, cannot happen on top of the mountaintop. Peter, James, and John cannot take that moment and hoard it and guard it in charge of mission. That's not what is in God's plan at that moment. God's will, God's desire that is being worked out through Jesus. It is about the Exodus, the salvation, the liberation of a people. And that is when, as the cloud comes around, that great cloud of witnesses that surrounds Jesus and Peter and James and John, who stand in our place, as that cloud surrounds them, we hear that voice that we heard once before at the baptism of Jesus say, "This is my son, this is my child, listen to him." Don't make assumptions. Don't think what you think is what I'm doing. God is saying, listen to me. Listen to me. And at that moment, that mystery, that transfiguration, everything that was glorious and awe-inspiring came back to the drabbiness of the everydayness. And the Jesus that they knew is the Jesus that still stood before them, but at the same time, that moment was no longer the same. The good news of the transfiguration, of what happened there on the mountaintop, about the beginning of God saying, "This is the exodus of my people who are not just Israelites, but all human beings," begins as Peter, James, and John and Jesus head back down to the valley, back down to the plain, back down to where everybody is. And they meet the father who had a son who was possessed by a demon. That's the extraordinary, supernaturalness. The child was possessed, held captive, was being thrown around, abused, suffering, in pain. And as was his father, a parent. I mean, how many of you have seen your child sick and suffering? And how does your heart feel? The disciples tried to do something about it, to cast out the demons, because Jesus told them that they could do it as his disciples, as his students, but they couldn't. And at that moment, we see Jesus casting out the demon, liberating the child from the sickness and illness. And we see what the Exodus is. Unlike the Exodus with the Israelites in Egypt, which was a physically releasing of slaves, of a people, to go and create a new nation, to discover who they are in relationship to God, God is doing something even greater. A liberation of our minds, of our hearts, of our spirits, opening our eyes that God is a God of all creation, not just of a people or a chosen particular religion, that God is at work no matter what, doing great things. And it's at that moment, out of that exodus, that Jesus is leading us, that we are being led into a time and a place to see that truly the kingdom of God is here. That truly God is at work. That truly God is among us. That truly we, as we are freed through Christ, we can also do amazing things, just as Jesus did. We'll be free to feed the hungry.
to clothe the naked, to unfetter those that are held captive to whatever is holding them back, to be truly the people that God has dreamt of. To be a people that stand with people on the margins. We are free to do that. But we still have to go through the Exodus. And that's what the season of Lent is for us every year. This coming Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. It's the kickoff of the Lenten season. Imposition of ashes will be done with Pastor Katie over at Faith Springs. So if you want to go over there, if you have time on Wednesday, you can go there. Or come next Sunday, which is the first Sunday of Lent, and we'll do the imposition of ashes. And we'll kick off this holy time of traveling and journeying with Jesus. Being the people of the flock. Walking with Jesus as he leads us into the Exodus, into the liberation, into the freedom once again. Into the freedom of knowing who we really are. Who we are as the children of God. Defined not by this world, but by God alone. So let us begin a holy Lent on Wednesday. Until then, let us party in the presence of the transfigured Christ. All praise, honor, and glory be to you, O Christ. Amen.